into another dimension, a dimension of insight. You are entering a place where reality collides with truth.
We're here.
There are no limits, there are no boundaries. This is Offplanet Radio.
And we welcome you back to hour number 2 of Offplanet Radio for August 29th, 2012. I'm Randy Maugans. The website is offplanetradio.com, and offplanetradio.net is the listening post. We are being broadcast over wolfspiritradio.com, and my thanks to Dave and to the folks over at Wolf Spirit Radio who stream us and make this show possible. My guest this hour, as last hour, is Philip Coppens, and Philip, welcome back.
Thanks for continuing to have me on, Randy.
You left us with, well, you summarized some things and other things kind of dangled. One of the questions that came up on the chat wasn't there an agreement between church and science about 300 years ago that one would promote and research theology only, and one would research worldly phenomena and ignore spirituality? Is there this schism between our streams of knowledge?
Yes, and it's a very sad thing. And I think it's actually something which, once this economic crisis is going to ebb away and some new kind of, form of work.
A new economy? Yeah. I see that too.
And I think at that moment in time, in about 10 or 15 years or so, I think really there's going to be a really outcry from the general population towards science, who's basically, being paid by us to do very little. And we tend to think that science is really scientific and academic, but it's not. We somehow think that climate science is the odd one out, well, there are good scientists who say that there is such a thing as climate change, and then there are bad scientists who are in the pocket of big oil and whatever. And first of all, that's a completely fabricated ideology. Big oil is quite happy with climate change because guess what? They get government grants of hundreds of millions of dollars to develop newer this and newer that, which is cleaner this and cleaner that. So they're perfectly happy with the world being convinced that there is such a thing as climate change. But no, this standoff between yes and no sayers in science is innate to the subject. And it boils down to the fact that science is, scientific, which equals guesswork. Nobody knows.
Thank you for that.
And so you have a body of information, and certain people interpret it like this and certain people interpret it in a different way. And that is the case with climate change, that is the case with archaeology, that is the case with, everything. Very few sciences are exact. And even those who are exact are not as exact as we would like them to be. But the big problem I find is that they really, really feel like they are completely uninterested in answering some of the big questions. They are more than happy to do the mundanest of things, but answering whether or not there is life after death, whether we are alone, those kind of things, not so much. And it's a very sad situation to find ourselves in, that science has basically said that they're unwilling to address the biggest questions which we are facing, even though the scientific methodology can be absolutely applied to this. And so we see that there really are a number of people out there who are doing stuff into the near-death experience all by themselves. They're medical doctors. They have very hard information which shows that something is happening, and they really are the ones who are trying to put it out there. That science should be looking into these things and should be investigating these things, but they have a hard time convincing their fellow scientists of all of these things.
Sorry, I had to mute out there for a second. I had a phone going off. So we've got our.
Oh, you've beaten me now. It's 2 for you and 1 for me.
We're supposed to turn our phones off. We're professionals here, but we don't do that, and people don't know. It's like, don't you know I'm on the radio right now? And they're going, no, I didn't know that at all. I wanted to talk to you. Then we'll get them to call in on the show, because I see some people do want to do that as well. So we've got this weird schism between faith, spirituality. I don't consider religion, and I don't think you do either, as the same thing as the spirituality that's emerging out of this very interesting conversation that people like us are having right now. Because if you look at the ancient alien question, you're confronted with some fundamental questions about what you believe exists outside of yourself, as well as possibly what exists within you.
Mm-hmm. And that is to some extent, with the ancient alien question, I come to say that there's several reasons why the question, were we alone or not, hasn't been answered. Part of it is because science is basically unwilling to help. So, for scientists to kind of say, well, there is no evidence for this. It's like, well, there is evidence, there's no proof. Part of it is because it involves your active cooperation in answering some of these questions, and because you're not interested, we'll never have the end. You'll never help us. But there's also this approach, which I think has been bad or too narrow focused, which was that we were only ever interested, apparently, in physical contact with ET landing somewhere and shaking hands with some of our ancestors and saying, hey, how are you doing? Great weather, right? And then kind of like helping them with building monuments. And that is not always the case. There is, definitely an awful lot to be said about non-human intelligence contacting us through, I can use 100,000 words, whether it's spiritual means, I would say non-physical means of communication. And again, I show modern examples of how this happened, and there are examples from our ancestors who underline or confirm that this is what they thought as well. Now, what I do in the Lost Civilization Enigma is to actually say, by the way, from where it appears, this thing about non-human intelligence contacts probably began somewhere about 25,000 years ago. It could have happened thousands of years before, but we have no evidence for this. If you're willing to believe that, that's fine. But 25,000 BC, we're kind of going to go, oh, okay. And then the closer it comes, like the 4,000 BC period, you see more of it happening. And then it pretty much continues up until we kind of like stop believing in them. But when you start going back before 25,000 BC, you see that our ancestors were already civilized. For example, all cultures across the world mapped the stars identically.
Yes.
And that shows you, that either somebody across the world kind of like, printed out a manual and said, this is how you should read the stars. And then for thousands of years, we all stuck to it. Or that very early on, the first men, already were dividing them in a certain way. And there's now evidence that Neanderthal man was actually already doing this, that they had awareness of the stars, and that they were kind of like, incorporating this. But also, I think specifically, they were also aware of the fact that they had a soul. They realized that we were, not just limited to this environment, but that there was also something beyond that. And I think, and, this is kind of like what I'm pointing at in the Lost Civilization Enigma, is that really our ancestors' discovery that we were a species which was here on planet Earth, but not just for an earthly lifetime, but that's something from us or in us or about us existed beyond that. That is really the start of civilization. It's really the start where you see that our ancestors, begin to realize certain things and begin to play with these things. And there are, obvious examples for this, like the oldest things which we see, Göbekli Tepe, Cataluyuk, more recently, but still 3000 BC wise, pyramids in Peru. All of these things, everything which we see, are always what we would call religious monuments. They are temples. They are temples where people went to communicate with something. These were active participation centers where people walked into and said, like, hey, let's communicate with something which is outside of this world. And I think what really happened, and I touched upon this briefly in the Lost Civilization question, is really this point that our ancestors at one point, probably through complete accident, probably, what happened was a child or some guy had just realized that with a coconut you could play soccer, and then realized that maybe, it wasn't the best of things. But, at some point a coconut must have hit somebody. He must have had some kind of like weird thing happen to him. Some other guy might have had a heart attack and whatever, somebody might have drowned. And at one point, all of these people began to relate weird things which happened to them, which we would classify as near-death experiences. And because there was no kind of like, newspapers who were saying, ooh, this is weird, or there wasn't any kind of, ill omen to talk about these things, they kind of like must have realized, man, what you've told is exactly what I've experienced. And I think over, thousands of years, they really began to explore, and they began to make what happened, what I would say, randomly, uncontrollably, they began to explore. And I think this is where the role of shamanism came in. I think this is also why our ancestors began to make certain potions, which allowed them to walk into these other realms, in a very scientific setting. And these temples across the world really are further evidence of this, that, our ancestors basically, what temples were places where you would go to have otherworldly experiences. Just like today, a restaurant is a place where you're going to have food.
Mm-hmm. So we made all these assumptions.
Assumptions as in?
Yeah. We made a presumption based on our own experience rather than looking at the evidence and not extrapolating out. We've kind of closed off the argument right away.
Well, we are doing that, yeah. We kind of like whenever you say like, well, somebody went into the Amazon and he had this magic potion, pretty much everybody will say, oh, it's a hallucination, as in it's not real. That is not, the reality, pardon the pun, of what our ancestors were doing. Cocaine, LSD, and all of these things which are freely available in the Western world is not identical to what our ancestors were concocting. Our ancestors were concocting potions whereby they tried to separate the mind from the body for a period of time and wanted to see what was happening. And that is different from, what even today we call recreational drugs. We have it in the title. Well,
this is where Terence McKenna was going when he formulated all this. He sort of made the differentiation that this was something that was designed to be a mystical experience. It's how we got people going back into the shamanistic aspect of ayahuasca and things like that to re-tap into something that was inside us, which was what I talked about in the first hour, was the spirituality within us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We do have a caller.
Yes, you do.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Give us your first name.
My name is, I'll give you the whole thing. It's Mary Teresa Clayton, and I'm an author, but I'm an author of fiction.
I know who you are. Yes, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Coppens, I'm a fan. I have a couple of things that I'd like to go over with you, and so long as I don't step on anybody's toes, I'll just go for it. One, I'm a blood type O negative. That may or may not mean anything to you. the one thing I wanted to talk to you about were the secret societies that exist inside of religions. They're known as the mystical parts of the religion, and only a few people are allowed inside of that practice to learn the mystic aspects of the religion. And I was very fortunate to get inside of the Catholicism, the mystic part of Catholicism, enough that I am no longer Catholic. And I now am studying what is called esotericism, which is more of like the Zoroastrian. And I would just consider myself to be a mystic, somebody who's out there just kind of, looking for answers. I'm not a psychic. I don't call myself a psychic. I don't think I'm psychic. I don't feel psychic. I don't talk to dead people. And I don't channel anyone. However, my house is filled with it. It was here when my husband was alive, and now that my husband has passed, he is now here. And we have many witnesses to this, family, friends, and the 4 people who rent from me, who rent rooms in my house. I have a very big house. Have all seen what he's very playful. I personally feel him in other ways. So I do know that there is life after death. I just think that the vessel that carries life is no longer with us because it's not infinite. So I wanted to put those 2 things together about the mysticism that's not given to the everyday man, that knowledge that only a few are given. And once it's given, and it's funny that you have to go through this vetting before you're even allowed to receive this information, and you receive it in small increments, as if any time you could get too much, you'd turn on them, which is exactly what we did. So our education stopped. But that's okay. We learned enough to know better. We do know that there's life after death. And then you brought up the subject of alchemy, which also ties into here. And my understanding of alchemy, Mr. Coppens, is more than just trying to turn metal into silver or gold. But alchemy was also a method of trying to find eternal youth, or to find eternal life, to find that eternity. And I think that part of that alchemy is knowing how to make that transition between within the corporal body to outside the corporal body. Now, that is directly from my husband. And he says that's the trick.
Is there a question here? Do you have
Yes, there is.
Okay.
I'm getting to it. I'm getting a little bit too much, I guess. On December 3rd, the Orion's belt is supposed to line up with the pyramids. There are an awful lot of old adages that are given, and a lot of old philosophers who have talked about the different things that happen in the sky, and the old adage that what is above is also below. And do you feel that that the coming together of the Orion's belt with the 3 pyramids is going to have any kind of significance to us spiritually? I'm not talking about the 212 thing or the end of the world. I'm just saying that it's going to have some sort of spiritual opening.
Well, if it is, it's going to be great because I'll be in Egypt around that time. So.
Awesome. That's awesome.
But I think the answer is probably, but to what extent? These things, there are examples of how there were temple complexes in which you basically had a dark environment, and specifically bright stars like Sirius or Canopus, which in Egypt are visible. They when they would rise or where they would be in a certain position, the temples were arranged in such a way that all the other light didn't exist, and only the light from that star would be cast into the place where you were and would kind of like hit your body. And it was deemed to be kind of like you became one with this star's energy because you were receiving it. And I do think that, like bringing it to something which you were saying before, our bodies need to be prepared. For the Olympic Games, Usain Bolt and my body, apart from him being taller and better looking, are exactly the same. But he can make it run 9 point whatever seconds, and I'm about a second slower. That might not mean much, but for that it is quite a bit. And there are very simple reasons for that, which is that his body has been trained. And I stopped running when I was 18 and basically didn't train ever after as a runner. The same thing with when you say that our souls or our bodies or parts of our bodies are going to go to another world reality. They need to be trained for that as well. There are chemical means through which this can happen, and there are various disciplines. The Eastern discipline basically kind of like says like it's a chemistry or a chemical reaction which happens in your body. And whereas, in the Amazon and in the Western world, we tend to use chemicals as kind of like means to accomplish this, the Eastern discipline basically says, but what if there are no chemicals? Or, let's do it without the chemicals, but still get that chemical reaction triggered. And when you do that, yes, you begin to explore the world. And this is where the ancient Egyptian religion comes to so much into focus, because what they were doing was they were exploring that other reality. Not every ancient Egyptian.
With or without drugs? I mean, were they doing this with drug interaction, or were they able to explore this without the use of drugs?
Both, and to some extent they didn't really care. The most cultures basically said the exploration of this other reality is far more important than how we do it. There's just a cultural tendency or a cultural preference between cultures as to what methodology they chose. But pretty much every culture was mainly interested in getting there and then exploring that and making contact with the intelligence which were there, helping, getting a helping hand from these guides on the other side. And that is something which you see everywhere. And there is then also the role of the ancestor, which is in essence what's happened with your husband. He is on that other side, and he is also there to help. I would assume his help is more of an emotional means, but in essence,
absolutely.
But in essence, our ancestors were kind of like saying, they can do everything, and it is us inviting that link. And there's very beautiful aspects about how, the deceased remains alive. You can look at it two ways. One, when he had a reason, when there was a need for him, but basically it was, when he was remembered, when the people had a memory of him. And the worst thing our ancestors felt which could happen to somebody was that when they were forgotten, which quite often meant that people who were lonely, didn't have children, their graves or a memorial would be placed, as we do today, in very public spaces along roads, so people would remember them, and so something would continue to exist. And our ancestors had such a diverse understanding of we kind of go, okay, we have a body and then a soul. Well, for an ancient Egyptian, there were 5 other things to do with that as well. Some of them which remained attached to the body. And each one of them had some sort of intelligence associated with it. A very long-winded answer to basically say yes. We had once a discipline to work with our body to explore these other things, and to make contact with these non-human intelligences, whether they are ancestors or aliens. It doesn't really matter. Again, it's...
Well, he says that they exist on the other side. He said that they are there. And he also told me that as a child, if I could go back to remembering as a child, that I could leave my body, and I believe it's called transmigration. You're going to have to forgive me because I'm old and this is all new subject matter to me. He said transmigration of the soul, where your body can leave its carnal phase and release and move around a little bit, go places and things. But he told me that they can do the same thing. One of the problems is they can take on mortal or more mass on this side of the veil, and the veil is very thin. It's the equivalent of the way he explained it to me was elephants hear real low, dogs hear real high, eagles can see things a mile down, they can see the whiskers on a rat before they go down and pick it up, whereas everything's so hyper, and that's the way it is there. Whereas here we're very limited by human eyes, human ears, and our human senses. And whereas there's some benefits to being in a human body, which he misses, he prefers this other realm that he's in because it's much more freer. And he's telling me that the entities that everybody calls the ETs are also within this realm, but they can go from one to the other. They can come from there to here. They can manifest themselves in both places. And that's why, because when he was alive and I would see things and he'd say, he made sure that he made it understood that I was actually seeing things, that was not a figment of my imagination.
Can I ask you a question? Did your husband,
Sure.
was your husband predisposed to that type of belief system in his...
No.
No?
Not. As a matter of fact, I scared the hell out of him. He held on to his Catholic beliefs. I let mine go. He said his rosary. I'll tell you, 2 nights before that he died, a man stood at the side of the bed and scared the witches out of him. And he woke me up twice. And I couldn't see this person, only he could see him. The day that he died, we rolled him into the surgery room, and he looked at me and told me, I must see Sedona. He said, you have to go to Sedona. That's the only place you're going to feel it, which I didn't understand at the time. And I said, yes, I'll go to Sedona. And he said, that's where you'll feel it. And I said, okay. And then he told me that one of the young men who were living here was going to be the man of the house, that he liked this young man very much, and that he wanted him to be the man of the house. And I had absolutely no idea that any of this was prophetic in any way. That was the last time I spoke to him. Those were the last things that he said to me. So I made the trip to Sedona, which is a whole other story that maybe you and I can interview with.
Yeah, why don't you get in touch with me after the show? Send me an email or give me your contact.
The Sedona thing was bizarro.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, a lot of things happen. Now, if I were the only person seeing them, I'd have to say that it's that crazy widow thing going on. But I have to tell you, I'm not sad. I was told immediately when he took his last breath, and it was him talking to me out of my mouth so that my ears could hear. I didn't get this for weeks, but I finally figured that out, why that came out. And the words were, this is not a bad day, this is a good day. And I kept saying that, and they all thought I had gone absolutely nuts. But I wasn't sad at all. And I had lost my life partner. But I wasn't sad because my understanding in that moment was he had not gone anywhere. He just wasn't physically with me anymore. Then that's really been the only difficulty I've had in losing my husband, is I can't reach over and touch him.
Yeah. Do you have another question? Because I want to move on here. I want to take.
No, please do move on, and I really appreciate that you put up with me this morning. I had a whole list of questions.
Good. Well,
I love you, Philip, and I look forward to seeing all of your radio shows. I'll be here every time.
Get in touch with me. We'll talk.
It sounds fine.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful show. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we'll take a few more callers. The telephone number is United States, that's international code 1, 717-910-0544 is the studio direct line. That's 717-910-0544 to speak with my guest, Philip Coppens. And so I guess we got some feedback there on some of the things that we talked about in the first part of the show, and kind of this comfort level with discussing things that are not mainstream right now, Philip.
Yeah, and they're like she's confirming precisely what I was saying, but also like the story which she told about her deceased husband, returning, is precisely the kind of thing which is timeless. It would have happened to somebody who left 35,000 years ago, and it is happening to somebody, as we speak. Somebody today is in contact, and you sometimes see interesting interesting parallels. Like Yoko Ono was once interviewed about, John Lennon, and she was asked something like, "Do you miss him?" And she said no, because now we're together all the time. Mm-hmm. Queen Victoria was absolutely in love with Prince Albert, and he died, and she went on to live. And it is clear that he spoke to her, and it's not a famous movie, and it was actually more made for television. It's a Billy Connolly movie. I think it's called Mr. Brown, and it's about this relationship which she develops with a Scottish man, played by Billy Connolly. And basically, Albert has died. The Queen is in mourning. And then she meets this Mr. Brown, who is this Scottish guy. And there's like stories as to whether or not she fell in love with him. Well, a Scottish professor, Professor Archie Roy, has done research into this. He's seen some of the correspondence between these two people, and came away with the information that Brown channeled Albert. Mm-hmm. And he was basically sought after because he was a channeler, and she even though she had Albert constantly in her head, she clearly wanted something more. She wanted to have him speak and have him in a sort of body. So she went into she went to look and found this Mr. Brown, who basically continued the channelings for her, so that kind of like Albert had come alive again. Those are like just two examples of very famous cases and people, but on a much more mundane and everyday level, it happens to hundreds of thousands of people, and the likes of Mary and all of these hundreds of thousands of people elsewhere. They are the ones, I think, who at one point in the future are going to say, like, seriously, when are we going to look into this thing? When are we going to be given the
I think that time's
opportunity?
Now. I Philip, the sense I have right now, and I've said it, other people have said it, the veil's thinning. And I think we get the sense of that. Do you get the sense of that?
Well, the veil is thinning, but we are also still so wrapped up into our daily realm. We are, as individuals as such, but as a species, afraid of what's going to happen to the world. Can we feed our children? Situations of
we're still caught in materialism.
Well, I mean, this thing about a euro crisis in Greece is great, and we think it's just a game, but it's affecting real life people in Greece. People in Greece, if you break a leg and you go into a hospital, there are certain hospitals in Greece right now who do not have plaster or anything else, or crutches or stuff like that. Wow. to cast your leg. And so they basically kind of go like, if you can buy these materials somewhere. Which you can, you can buy them in pharmacies and stuff like that. And if you bring them to the hospital, then we can help you. But otherwise, we can't, because of the state of the state is in. And that is like just one example out of dozens, if not hundreds, of how we are living in a world whereby we fear through an imaginary constraint that we should be potentially dying because we have created this economic model which is failing, and nobody knows what to substitute it with. And I really hope that when you say the time is now, that some of these changes, these great changes, and these challenges to science are going to happen quickly. But I think they're going to take time, because we are 6 billion people, and most of them are.
I agree. When I say that, I qualify that by saying that there's a few of us that I think are becoming aware. We do have a caller, and caller, you'll need to turn your speakers down before you come on, but go ahead and come into the conversation. Do we have a caller? I saw 239 area code and a 635 pop up. Maybe we dropped them. Okay, well, Okay, I thought we had a caller. Are you still there, Philip?
I am.
Okay, good. Because sometimes when we start pouring calls in, things get a little trippy. Yeah, when I said that, what I'm saying is that it's not a universal phenomenon, and you bring an interesting point to the table. We have these crises in our world, which, you know, I don't know what your take on it is. A lot of this is product of a control grid in the world right now. But they're real people, they're real problems, and we keep getting pushed back into a place where we deal with our physical reality, where it displaces the ability to deal with these, I guess you would say, more elevated areas of inquiry.
Yes, and you know that I think is the sad state of the world right now. We are in a crisis, and we're crying out for help, and we think there's nobody to help. And I think to a large extent, you know, we're going to have to write this one out ourselves and kind of like realize that we have created this ourselves, and it's not real.
Yes.
All of this is numbers currently sitting in computers somewhere, which says this is worth more than that, but it's not real. And I don't know how well known this was outside of Britain, but there was a very interesting experiment done either by complete coincidence or by the powers that are, and it was in June when a bank had a computer glitch. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that computer glitch, for a week, hundreds of thousands, actually millions of people, couldn't get access to money.
I read about this, yes.
And now you would think, I mean, first of all, it was extremely interesting to find that the government didn't intervene, but there was no panic. There, you know, nobody was starving. Yes, people had difficulty, but they basically kind of like went to the bakers and said like, hey, we've paid for years our bread. Right now we don't have access to money, and you know why, because, you know, television who are reporting about that. Are you okay if I pay you tomorrow? You know, in the end, tomorrow turned out to be a week later, through the bank not being able to sort it out. But an interesting experiment was basically that for a week, millions of people in Britain were able to live happily, eat, sustain themselves without money. The economy kept ticking over. There was no crisis. You know, as I said, the government didn't even have to intervene and kind of like, you know, declare some kind of whatever for these people. And that is, you know, something which is I find interesting and should make us realize that if we really let go of this system, we'll be okay. In fact, the burden, you know, will be lifted from us. But, you know, it's letting go of the greatest created fantasy which mankind has ever done. And there's an HBO movie, Too Big to Fail, and kind of I think it's the greatest thriller ever. Like, you know, I've never been so scared in my life as watching that. When you realize that the people who we voted into office have absolutely no idea as to what is going on, and that it is this one professor dude who's basically kind of like sort of explaining to them what might be happening and what might happen, but that nobody has any idea. You know, it's not even controlled chaos. It's chaos which nobody seems to be aware of as to what it is, how it works, and what to do about it. And that is something which we're trying to protect right now by, you know, telling people in Greece that when they've broken a leg to basically go out and buy the stuff themselves because, you know, it's so out of control.
Well, isn't this the great mind control grid itself, the money? It's illusory. It always has been illusory. Whatever we've traded, now we're in this electronic environment where we're basically churning bits through computers. It's not real to anyone, including the people who supposedly do the accounting. We watch money stream across networks in billions and trillions. Nobody is capable of even fathoming the zeros behind the initial number anymore. It's simply an illusion of wealth which is being poured across borders through these computer networks.
Yeah, and we have created this great virtual reality, computers, Facebook, online gaming. There's some statistic about how many percent of Asian kids, I think Japanese kids, are spending time on Second Life, and it's frightening. All of these things, we've created so many virtual things, and reality, when you start looking at it from the perspective of a soul, it is like the soul seem to have created this gigantic game called incarnation. Let's play with a body because it's fun. We can run with it, and you can make love with it, and you can do so many things with this thing. And if you can cook, you can eat good food, and all of these things, and it's so much fun. That is partly the reason why we chose to incarnate, to enjoy life. But right now, what we see is that the game we're playing, Reality 1.0, we somehow hate, and therefore we have created virtual realities, which are, as real or as unreal as Reality 1.0. And I'm kind of going why don't we address Reality 1.0 and make it a fun game again? Then we are playing real life, and people who were in alchemy or those kind of things will say the master alchemist creates his own reality and begins to create, and that's all fine. And that's all, very positive. But I'm pretty sure, that creation should probably happen in a nice environment rather than as an escape clause, because people are no longer able to cope with Reality 1.0, i.e. the real world out there, because somehow it has become such a burden and such a stressful thing.
Well, the problem with the Second Life reality, the virtual world, is in a lot of cases, we are cutting ourselves off from community. We are cutting ourselves off, and we're all doing it. I watch humanity every day walking around staring at the palm of their hands and texting. I've seen people almost be run over by cars doing this, and it is almost like a willful cutting off of human interaction at a time when we need human interaction more, beginning to patch together the network of the human stream of consciousness.
Yes, isn't the average statistic that about across America there is about 2 minutes of real conversation between parents and children on a daily basis? We tell our kids when we're talking to each other for 3 minutes, oh my God, we're no longer average Americans. But it's a sad reality, and all of these tools and all of these techniques are great. A laptop is a brilliant tool. A mobile phone is great. I can speak to people who I love, when I'm physically separated from them for whatever reason. But it doesn't mean that we constantly have to be glued to our Facebook status or play, Angry Birds, because we somehow have gotten it into our heads that when we're on the subway or on a bus, what we definitely shouldn't be doing is speak to the person sitting next to us. That's the worst thing which could happen to you, when you're on a bus. Get real. We are, as you say, isolating ourselves from being normal human beings.
And I guess, the symptom of that is that we're sitting here tonight talking among ourselves. In a sense, we are a virtual community. We're extending ourselves through this technology, and I'd like to think this somehow opens up the conversation. But at the same time, I almost feel complicit in it myself a lot of times, in that I cut myself off, or I see other people who are spending endless amounts of time on chat rooms and different websites, and they're basically becoming disassociated with the real world around them because, and I'm watching comments right now, people feel alienated Well, and we've spent all this time talking about aliens, and the real alien may actually be the human. Isn't that odd?
Well, and that is true. And to a large extent, yes, online chat rooms and all of that stuff, because people feel, again, when you are in a world where you are absolutely convinced, like Mary is, that your deceased husband is there, but unlike Mary, there are hundreds of thousands of women and men out there who either don't have the courage or whose children are simply not predisposed to even accepting the possibility. Those people, if they want to talk about these things, which is better than cropping it up and not being able to talk about it at all, they will go to online chat rooms and kind of, if they exist. I mean, I don't know whether they exist for these kind of topics, but like for everything else, whether it's the gay teenager in a community where being gay is absolutely frowned upon, if you live in a world where you cannot be your true self, you are going to really go to an online community where you think you can be your true self, and that is different from basic. Well, to some extent, it's different. There are two sides of a larger issue, which is that
playing Angry caller too, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, playing Angry Birds playing Angry Birds on your phone and on the bus really is because you don't like being on that bus and you try to escape from it.
Yeah, hi caller.
But it doesn't have an identity issue there.
Just a minute, please. Okay, sorry, we have a caller. I have to bring him up live, and sometimes it takes him a minute to patch in. Hi, caller. Give us your first name and say hello to Philip.
Hi, Philip. My name's Greg.
Hello.
And actually, I have a couple questions. One is if you could give any thoughts or feedback on Colonel Philip Corso, the late Colonel Corso, who worked with the government.
Well, I'm not a big Corso fan. I have written briefly about him in an article which is on my website. There's only so much you can sometimes say about certain people in writing. To me, Philip Corso, was a disinformation agent. He is known to have been a disinformation agent in his career. That was his speciality. And I think he, to the end of his lifetime, was committed to creating smoke screens and was more than proud of being a prominent part of that. Go ahead.
How do you feel about his claims of kind of seeping out the information for fiber optics and microchips, etc., like that he claims? What do you think of that?
I think what he wrote. Did something happen in Roswell? Yes. Do I think that anything which Philip Corso wrote about it is true? No. Certain things have happened, and your government will want you to believe carefully spun lies about it because they are invested into various plots and subplots as to how to work these things. They have been able to create this wonderful, and I find it always interesting that you can watch a Hollywood movie which basically says like NASA faked whatever, NASA did this, or like the U.S. Air Force covered up Roswell, and like Independence Day is one, and then at the end of the movie it'll kind of go like, we would like to thank the active cooperation of the U.S. government and the U.S. Air Force, and you kind of think like, are you joking me? Did you read the script? So clearly, this idea that a government is completely pure or completely evil. They play a game, and they have always played a game, and they continue to play the game. And in the case of Corso, he was part of this game being played. So some of the things in there are what I would say sort of true, but nothing in there is in my opinion at least 100%.
Seemingly coincidental as it comes out, possibly,
Yeah, and I mean,
at the end of his life, coincidental.
Well, I mean, he was a guy who had been doing these kind of things. There's a number. There's so many things out there. People don't seem to understand that there are such a thing as disinformation agents. The idea, the Soviets had an entire area of an entire department of people who were creating lies, basically to blame America for everything which went wrong in the world. The Americans had a similar department. They blamed the Russians. That's kind of like the name of the game. It happens today as well. The Republicans blame the Democrats for everything, and vice versa. And they will use blogs. They will use weird kind of like news sites. People can now, CNN is now the worst because basically anybody with any accreditation can get a CNN kind of like opinion thing, and then it says in small letters, this is actually an opinion. CNN has not validated anything whatsoever. But people send sometimes this stuff to me, and they kind of go like, have you seen this? CNN is reporting. And it's like, no, somebody wrote something on the CNN website.
Yes, yeah.
And it's the same thing. Kind of a very interesting case was, I'm sorry, it's a bit off topic, but a few years ago somebody kind of like wrote a story about Arafat, and based on a book which had appeared in English but hadn't been available yet in America. And the guy who wrote this article basically was reporting it secondhand. He hadn't read the book, but he had heard that this book contained something about Arafat, and it was copied, I kid you not, in one day about 50 times over the internet. Everybody was kind of like referring to this, and
I followed this story. I know exactly what you're talking about. We watched it morph as it moved through the internet.
Yeah, and I contacted this guy and I said, like, you do know that on this page it doesn't say that at all, does it? And he kind of went like, oh, it didn't?
We had similar stories here in the U.S. this summer about troop movements, which was linked into a certain internet meme that went on from April until about a month ago, having to do with an insurrection here in the United States. And at one point I tracked one of these stories across the internet and watched the embellishment that occurred on the story. It began with a photograph and a blurb, and by the time it was done, they were mounting troops in 5 cities, and it was just one complete, it was the perfect stream of information that builds as somebody adds facts to it, like that little game you play where you pass around a piece of information, and each person, as it goes on, it changes and it grows and it morphs.
Mm-hmm. And that's I think what Corso was doing. He's using the holes in the story. Some of these things were developed by people in kind of areas where nobody will ever get into because they are so specialized, and nobody some of these things were done as part of government contracts, whereby basically the government says, like, I own this, and I own the right to say anything about this discovery because we paid for it. And so some of these discoveries or these inventions are completely unaccredited and go from there.
On his little show, he was quite dramatic with his account of his personal dealings with extraterrestrials and stuff. Thank you for that insight on him. And the second part is, I know you have the trip coming up to Lima, Peru. It sounds amazing with Machu Picchu, the Nazca lines, etc. With everything and everybody, scientists, archaeologists that are looking and searching, is there anything new that's just come up? And if not, are there, say, your top 3 points of interest that you personally are looking forward to people finding some things? Could you talk on that briefly?
Well, one thing which is completely out of my hands, is a story which is mentioned in the Ancient Alien Question, the book. It's a story about the Dropper, which is a Chinese tribe. You can read about it a bit on my website as well. It is basically potentially one of the better evidences for the fact that in our human history we have been, contacted by non-human intelligences, and that there are physical descendants of this living in a remote area of China. It requires active cooperation of the Chinese government and scientists, and is really not something where I'm going to be the prime mover for, I think, because there are other people like Hartwig Hausdorff who are trying to push that far harder and far better than I would be able to do that. The story of Atlantis, however, is something which is very close to my heart. Very early on in the 1990s, I was given a study by a Belgian historian called Marcel Mestak, who showed that there was a very strong connection between the megalithic civilization, specifically megaliths in France, and what Plato had written down about Atlantis. Specifically, he was able to show that some of these monuments were built identical to the dimensions which Plato was given for Atlantis. Unfortunately, this Belgian historian called Marcel Mestak had died by the time I had been given this information. I was in extensive contact with his widow. I have written a bit about that, but basically I need far more time and spend far more time in France in being able to bring this work into, from an article or a chapter into a book, a chapter in a book to a book. So that is something which I definitely want to do over the next few years, and I'm slowly beginning to get there, because I am spending more time in France, and I'm visiting some of the places he visited, and also 30 years has gone on, so an awful lot more is known about the sites he was writing about. The third things, I don't know. Together with my wife, we are very interested in relics to do with Christianity. We believe that some of the most interesting relics, like the Shroud, are very ill understood.
Yes. Thank you.
And one of the things actually with the Shroud is that it's like, at one point in my life I said I'll never write about Jesus Christ because it's too controversial and hundreds of thousands of other people are doing it. Why would I be doing it? And I'm beginning to slowly feel that I might be going back on that promise. But hey, the book will be about the book will be about the Shroud, not about Jesus Christ. So that's a big difference.
Very nice. Philip, along with Christian artifacts, how do you feel about the Vatican? Would you believe that they would be hiding many things there? I mean, very deeply hidden.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether they're hiding so many things. I mean, my reputation, sorry, not my reputation, I think the reputation of the Vatican is that they more just destroy things. I mean, I don't think that the Vatican, I don't believe, well, let me rephrase it. Yes, the Vatican is hiding things, but I think that, the things we sometimes accuse of them of being in the Vatican archives, I think they've long disappeared. Like a smoking gun, you put into water and then you throw it in the ocean. You don't put it together in one area.
Isn't it really just the myth that's been created of all this stuff that's been hidden, though, that kind of continues this ruse? It's kind of a ruse of power that they hold hidden information. And our caller touched on a little bit of this, the first caller, about Catholic mysticism, and there's different tiers of knowledge within religious orders that are built as much on mythology and so-called sacred knowledge, esoteric knowledge that's hidden from the average person. This is kind of the bane of disinfo artists, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And one of the things is, yes, you have to tell the world that you are very powerful and you have to be afraid of it. The Roman Empire, an interesting statistic is that, like, in retrospect, the Roman Empire could have fallen 3 centuries before it actually fell, but for 3 centuries everybody was afraid of the Roman Empire, so they never attacked the Roman Empire until somebody kind of said, like, they're not that powerful anymore, and then they invaded and they fell.
Yeah.
The Vatican, however, is still, or at least up until a few decades ago was very influential. It's still very influential in countries like Italy, obviously for obvious reasons. In other countries, in Spain, it's a growing presence. So it does wield worldly power. There is an awful lot of money involved, and there's an awful lot of interests involved. The politics and the ways of the Vatican are one, because state and church, however much we can pretend that they're separate, they're one and the same. George Bush signed something during his presidency which basically said that Benedict would never be prosecuted in America, no matter what things people would find out about the Vatican under his papacy. There would nothing be ever done against him. So that is still immunity from prosecution as a head of state is quite a good deal. So there's all of those things, but again, yes, the Vatican is deemed. I should put this within the Illuminati world. The Vatican, is all powerful. The Vatican no longer is. A big chunk of its power disappeared during the 1970s. And it got regained a bit during the 1980s, but it's wobbly. But the people who are involved with some things of the Vatican, have power. Opus Dei is maintaining large sections of the Vatican power today, because the people who are prominent in Opus Dei are extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. At the end of the day, whether you call it the Vatican, who's the power, I hate all of these words, the Illuminati and all of that stuff. Basically, the short answer to all of these questions is people with lots of money have lots of means to do whatever they want. That has always been the case, and that hasn't changed. So, who rules the world? Those with power, those with money, because guess what? It's a world which is ruled by money, and you can be very idiotic about it and say, well, so the richest person in the world therefore has to have the most power. It doesn't work like that. Probably the second and the third richest person in the world realize that if they work together, they have more money than the richest person in the world, and they will try to do everything to get that richest person in the world from his power, so they are more powerful. This is where this virtual game of money comes in, and it's you can call it the power game, the Illuminati or whatever it is, but it's not as complicated as that. It's not as nefarious as that. It's basically people with power, people with money, have secrets, have done dirty things and continue to do dirty things and have dirty things in their closet. And guess what? For over the last 2,000 years, the Vatican has been one of the chief political parties and players on the world scene. So by default, they have loads of skeletons in their closet.
Right.
Anything else you want to ask, caller?
Oh no, Philip, thank you very much for sharing. I love your site. There's so much information and articles in there. Just beginning to scratch the surface, and thank you for having it up there. And it's been a pleasure being on your show. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for calling in. We got a couple of minutes here. We just run the show right over top everything else because we can, and because it's really interesting, and we got people involved. So it's a good conversation. Philip, you were cited as a researcher in a book written by Lynn Picnic and Clive Prince called the Stargate Conspiracy, and it's a book I'm somewhat familiar with, and somewhat familiar with at least one of the principles in the book. That book postulated that there is something very sinister behind the New Age movement, behind even some of the people that I think are operatives in the movements that we've been talking about, even some of, I will call them the agents who operate on the internet in shows like this one tonight. Can you address the disinfo agents that have penetrated this and how we sift them out and how we discern the kind of information that I believe people with integrity are bringing out versus an agenda that's kind of tilted towards spiritual deception?
It's hard. It's like it's finding out about friends. You look at certain things and you kind of go like, oh wow, that's cool. But most of the time, the general trend to me seems to be they either make a big claim about something, or they're extremely skeptical about everything. And they have like notions about who they are, and they create this air of mystique around them, and that makes them sort of indistinguishable from nutcases, but that is intentional. But there is a difference between the operations of a nutcase and the operations of a kind of a very clever person who pretends to be a nutcase. But yes, Stargate Conspiracy. I did research together with Clive Flynn, did most of the writing. When the book came out, even though the book is dedicated to me, I felt that they had, based upon the evidence, made an interpretation of the evidence which was available on the map, but not necessarily the most straightforward one and not necessarily the best one, which is when the book came out. Obviously, some of the people who they had a go at were extremely displeased, but what I would call like the neutral observers, like people who we had interviewed, Uri Geller, Dick Farley, those kind of people really felt that a big opportunity had been missed, and so I sort of addressed that to some extent in a series which is on my website called the Stargate Conundrum,
right.
Which kind of delves into where I felt the Stargate Conspiracy should have gone more into, but basically the mindset and the conclusions which Clive and Lynn drew was theirs, and also there was a certain kind of deadline to be met, which means that a certain amount of thinking went into that up until a moment in time, which not necessarily meant that thinking was in its most mature form. So there, I love the book in the sense that there are great unknown facts about things happening, about how the world of politics is interested and intrigued by these things. Nick Redfern just has a recent book out. I think it's something like the Pyramids and the Pentagon or something like that. Yeah. I haven't read it yet. It's
he's coming on in a few months. I'm going to talk to him about that. Yeah.
Cool. So that's kind of like in line with that, and I think he referenced the Stargate Conspiracy somewhere in there as well. But I need to kind of like read it rather than just kind of like leaflet through it. But the overall conclusion of the Stargate Conspiracy, I think, is this, which is that behind modern politics, and the Stargate Conspiracy only really looked at Western politics, specifically America and Britain, that there are people there who are interested in the paranormal, who are interested in weird things. Joe Podesta, who was, pretty much the guy who concocted all the levels of hierarchy within the Obama administration when Obama came into power, he's a fervent believer of extraterrestrial life. When he worked for Bill Clinton in his office, there was the famous poster from the X-Files, The Truth Is Out There, hanging in his office because he so enjoyed that show. Clinton was interested, Carter was interested, people in the 1950s were interested. Everybody has always been interested. In the 1930s, there are examples of, extremely important figures of the American government interested in things like Casey. All of these things we tend to forget. The Queen of England's husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, is not infatuated, but is extremely interested in UFOs. All of these people are, real people. They're not just secretary of whatever, and they have their interests, and an awful lot of these interests are to do with the kind of topics which we've been discussing about tonight. And I think what the real importance of Stargate Conspiracy was that this kind of like, aired that it brought it out into the open before it had been too much scattered across too many books, or in research which wasn't that clear, and specifically that there were certain things to do with like the Nine, which really became at some point, or at some points, kind of like almost obsessional. And then, what I tried to do with the Stargate Conundrum is that I tried to show that in the 1970s there was pretty much an active program within the secret confines of the U.S. government, which assumed as given that telepathy and all of these things existed, clairvoyance existed, and that they were doing various experiments which showed that this was real, but that at one point, basically, the plug was pulled from this, and the entire project was ridiculed in the 1990s by a hired academic help who was specifically chosen because everybody knew she was going to draw precisely the conclusions she was going to draw. Like, if you want to make an omelet, you're going to hire a chef. You're not going to hire a gardener. And that's kind of what the U.S. government did with that. And again, they get away with it because an academic has said, I did all of the analysis and there's nothing here. And that is simply not true. There is so much there. And what Stargate Conspiracy did was really briefly touch upon that and say, there's so much here, so much more than what we're doing. And again, the Stargate Conspiracy plus the Stargate Conundrum kind of like delves into all of that material and tries to make some sense of it.
You mentioned Uri Geller, and he's sort of faded in recent years, although he's still around. Do you think that Uri feels he was being exploited during the time that he was pretty much a forefront figure?
Yes, I mean, first of all, exploited. Uri has two gripes. The first one was that he was treated as a lab rat. He was taken from laboratory to laboratory to laboratory, and in each laboratory he was tested. Oh, could you do this? Oh, yes. Okay, you're telepathic, definitely. On to the next thing. Oh, yeah, he is telepathic. And he basically kind of like said, like, how many times are you going to test me the same tests all over? And he didn't sign up to be a lab rat. He wanted to have a normal life with wife and children. So he got mad about that. And then specifically, kind of like what he, kind of like, how can I put that? He felt that at one point people began to use him for their own purposes. Here's the guy out of Israel who can do all of these magical things. And then somebody thought, like, interesting. This is somewhat like a guy who we want.
Yeah, he was being set up as a messiah figure, basically.
Yeah, and he basically was informed that this was happening, rebelled against it, was helped into avoiding that identification from happening, and now is happy living with his wife, doing his shows, having visits from his kids, and kind of like he lives a life which he wants to lead rather than the life of a lab rat who at one point could well have been assassinated by some crazy guy who thought he was Jesus. And as he points out himself, those kind of people who were trying to set him up or trying to depict him as such didn't give anything about whether he was alive or dead, because guess what? Jesus was just as good dead as alive. In fact, it's easier to work with a guy who says he's not. Sorry, it's easier to work with a guy who's dead and pretend he could have been Jesus. He's alive and says, "Hey, I'm not Jesus." So he kind of like he definitely feels that he was somewhat abused, but that is kind of like his main gripe is basically that he, as part of the entire remote viewing project, he was treated as a lab rat, and specifically that he foresaw a future in which he would go from laboratory to laboratory to laboratory to be tested, retested, and retested again.
I get the sense that Ingo Swann feels that way as well here in the U.S., with the work that he did with Stanford Research. And then obviously they would have liked to kept going, but they then discredited themselves. I'm not sure which. So you have this repetitive pattern of setting something up and then basically knocking it back down again.
Well, I think in the case of Puthoff and Tark, they were told to discredit themselves.
Yeah. I do too. Listen, it's been fun. We have not gone anywhere near a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about, but that's okay. I really need to get you back again at some point. Tell us about Lost Civilizations, any other things that you have coming up, your website, and where people can find your books.
Well, there is various things out there. So my website is philipcoppens.com, which is PhilipCoppens. If you go on there, or when you go on there, you will find lots of articles which are for free. You will also see a list of all the books and the DVDs. Most recently, the books out are The Ancient Aliens Question. On October 22nd, there is a new book out called The Lost Civilization Enigma. Yesterday, the DVD came out of Ancient Alien Question, which is on things like Time Warner. I haven't checked; it might still be on pay-per-view. It definitely was recently on pay-per-view. So if you don't want to do the book, you can watch the DVD or watch it on things like Xbox, PlayStation, and all of these things, and as I said, pay-per-view on Time Warner and the various other ones. And for everything else, yes, go to my website. You can also go to Twitter or to Facebook. If you type my name in there, Philip Coppens, you will be taken to the respective pages. Click on like me or follow me, and you will get to get a few short messages every single day of very mundane and sometimes interesting things.
I doubt that it's mundane. Anyway, it's been a lot of fun talking to you, Philip. You can stay in line for a minute. I'll catch you on the other side. We're going to close this out. This is Offplanet Radio. I'm Randy Maugans. The truth is out there. It's inside you. Keep looking for it. We'll be back again next week for another show.
This is Offplanet Radio.